In August 2016, Port Slade, Brighton, a 19-year-old woman was found dead in her home. Her throat had been slashed and her body set alight. A suspect was quickly identified, her ex-boyfriend, whom she had reported numerous times for his obsessive, stalking, inappropriate behaviour, yet somehow she had been labelled as the one in the wrong and he the victim. This is what happens when systematic failings allow stalking to turn deadly. This is the murder of Shana Grice. Before I carry on with today's video, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce Etta Blue. This is Etta Blue. I'm not going to pretend that I don't believe that she is the most perfect baby that has ever been a baby, because I do. But on a serious note, and I've got to do this without crying because I'm finding it quite difficult to do that at the moment, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce her to you guys at YouTube, who have supported me through some really challenging times, if I'm honest. Just to let you know that we didn't keep a secret because we didn't want any of you to know. It was just because I thought it would tempt fate. We've lost too many babies to mention, and we never thought we were going to get the opportunity to be mummy and daddy, particularly to a little girl, because I was convinced that I could only ever bear boys. But here she is, and the feeling of not being stressed whilst doing YouTube for the last few years and doing my tours, which I just feel utterly blessed because I get to do what I absolutely love, we really think made a difference to the outcome this time, which is this just delightful little girl.
Little blonde angel. Little blondie.
We cannot thank you enough.
No.
So I'm not posting videos on other media outlets, so to speak. I just wanted to share her with you because, well, you know Chase, you know Molly, you know Wookie, you know all my animals, etc. And now, you know my little girl. Our little girl.
Our little girl.
Although basically my little girl. And just to share her for a couple of minutes before I start this next video. Thanks for everything. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I cannot tell you how many times I have had this case actually requested, and I have covered this in certain documentaries. I just wanted to make sure that I had the amount of time and the appropriate dedication to be able to do my best at bringing to light potential new information that you guys haven't heard about regarding the murder of Shana Grice. It is absolutely offensive to my sensibilities that I'm having to tell this story. I should not have to. Shana should still be alive. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever. It is devastating when you come across cases and you can see how things should have and could have played out so differently. This is a case of a young woman ignored, a young woman abandoned by the authorities, a young woman who had everything to live for and would be living had it not been for the bias and judgments, in my opinion, of certain individuals in authority who are meant to be there to protect us. And I don't think that I'm telling this story as an isolated case, because I've worked and spoken as well to women who've dealt with these kind of situations themselves, where somebody who's harassing them and stalking them doesn't get the treatment that that individual requires to prevent them from doing that further, meaning that these women are left in scenarios where they are literally living day to day being stalked and harassed. I appreciate that we are getting better at this, but for a very long time, when somebody was struggling with a stalker, you were basically made to feel that you were wasting police time if you went ahead and tried to get the support that you deserved and required. And today's case is going to describe in technical detail just how devastating, debilitating, and tragic this kind of refusal to accept the serious nature of such actions plays out in a case where a young woman loses her life because she isn't given the support that she absolutely 100% deserved. And the ripple effect of this case is huge. So many people have been affected by it. And it always annoys me that we get to a point where we'll talk about a case that changes things a little bit. And certainly the Shana Grice case has changed the face and landscape of our understanding around stalking. But it's too little too late, isn't it? Let's go back to the summer of 2015. We've got 18-year-old Shana Grice. She starts this new job. And she's basically working as a receptionist for Brighton Fire Alarms. Shana was the only child of parents Sharon and Richard, and that devastates me because we all know why I'm telling this story. And we're talking about a child who was literally adored by her parents, but the fact that she's an only child, it amplifies the message of this case even further, because it's almost impossible to imagine the future being completely eradicated. And for Sharon and Richard, that's what's happened. When your only child is killed, all of those expected events, from weddings to babies, grandparent situations occurring and watching your child grow and develop, they're stolen. And that's incredibly painful. In 2015, she's actually not living with her parents. She's living in a bungalow with two housemates. Her life is just beginning, and she's living in Portslade, Brighton. For those of you who aren't from the UK, Brighton is an effervescent, diverse area in the UK. It's a seaside resort. It is so lovely as a place to go and visit. And if you're a young person living in Brighton, everything's potential based. There are so many opportunities, so much excitement. The independent shops through to the nightlife make everything feel exciting. And I imagine that she was very much living in that position of hopefulness. She was happy. She was really vivacious as a young woman. Apparently she was always smiling, and people who knew her said that she was literally never grumpy. And she was one of those people who just made friends really easily. One of those individuals that you'd meet and you'd want to befriend because there was just something so lovely about them. At this point, she'd actually been in a long-term relationship with a boyfriend. Her boyfriend was a carpenter. He was called Ashley Cook. And they'd been seeing each other from high school. And psychologically, to connect and commit to somebody when you're at high school is quite challenging. We've all been in situations where, I don't know, a relationship in high school that lasts more than a week can feel like a lifetime, with all the dramas that are involved and engaged in that situation. So to actually have met somebody and to some degree settled down with him, that demonstrates loyalty, dedication, commitment, but it's going to be imperfect because you haven't had the opportunity to experience other people, other relationships. And some people don't. If you're like my sister, you marry essentially your first boyfriend and you live happily ever after. But if you're a dinted tin like me, you know, you have to go through some frogs, sometimes some snakes to get where you need to go, right? And being loyal and dedicated and committed to a relationship, it takes a level of maturity that often you haven't got when you're a teenager. So they've got together early on, and it makes sense to imagine that when you haven't experienced other relationships, there are moments when you'll look around and wonder whether there are other potentials and possibilities in your life with other guys. But they had, it said, planned to get married. So essentially they were very committed to each other at this moment in time. Shana had actually hoped that the new job that she was working in was going to help them save some money for her wedding. So even though they've only really been with each other, they are thinking about the long term. And I think that's really powerful because even though, like I said, when you're young, nothing is going to be perfect, it demonstrates the level of connection that they had. Now she starts her new job, and at that point she meets 26-year-old tire and exhaust fitter Michael Lane. Now he works at the same company, and according to friends, the attraction between them was pretty immediate. They start chatting, they start building rapport, and it isn't very long before Lane starts to take things to a different level. So he starts to shower her with gifts, he starts to be very complimentary. And I think if we were going to bring in a term that's often related to coercive control, even cult mentality, is we talk about love bombing. And people will often use the term love bombing in the context that this is a tool used to ensure that somebody is captured in a mindset of being adored, of being cared for, of having connection and belongingness. It's a very alluring experience. And it's not because that person is a fool. When somebody love bombs you, you are not going to be suspicious. The idea that people should be walking around thinking to themselves, well, this person's coming on very strong, presenting me with all these presents, being really complimentary and lovely to me, I should probably consider that they're a danger. That's not how it works. If you have somebody who is being incredibly attentive to you, who is being very loving towards you, who is raising you up as opposed to pulling you down, who's showering you with gifts, it takes a very strange personality to be thinking to themselves, all these nice things this person's doing for me, my God, I think they're a very suspicious individual. Most of us, particularly living in a capitalist materialistic state, think that's a nice thing. So love bombing is an incredibly powerful connector. That's why cults use it. That's why coercive controllers use it, because they know that good relationships, positive relationships, trusting relationships will often at the very beginning mirror that kind of behaviour. And I'm sure lots of you can remember a time where you ended up in a less than perfect relationship, but at the very beginning of it, the person seemed to literally have been sent from heaven. The only thing that they were missing was the halo. So he is building that relationship very, very intensely and very quickly. Now you have to bear in mind, yes, Shana is in a relationship. Yes, she is trying to save for her wedding, but this is the only relationship that she's ever had until this point. It's the only comparison base that she knows. Her current boyfriend, of course, won't have been able to do all those things initially in the relationship because they were at school. So there just isn't the opportunity economically to shower your partner with gifts, etc. And also, when you meet as young people, you haven't got the emotional literacy that you have when you're older. Bear in mind, the guy that she's met who's now showering her with all these gifts is in his late 20s. So the truth is, he's a lot more schooled in this area and will be a lot more schooled in the mindset of what he needs to do to impress her. So her comparison base is going to be a problematic one because, like I said, her current boyfriend can't compete with somebody who's come in like a whirlwind and is throwing all this stuff at her. She's understandably flattered because she's got this older admirer, there's chemistry between them, and he is pulling out all the stops. Now, she starts a secret relationship with Lane, and they continue that relationship on and off for just the next few months. And I imagine that she was incredibly guilt-ridden. I imagine that she was in a situation where she probably had certain regrets about this. And I also think that there is a normality to this kind of behaviour when, like I said, you have been in a relationship from a really early age. It's a testing out and then a realising that the grass isn't necessarily always greener that helps you to some degree solidify the commitment that you actually have. Now, Lane, pretty much from the get-go, becomes absolutely obsessed with Shana. And his behaviour is literally a concern pretty much from day one. So he displays some really stereotypical traits of a stalker from the get-go. Again, bear in mind, Shana wouldn't have a clue about these. She's a young girl. She is not schooled in the area of these kind of typical behaviours, and she has not got comparisons in relationships to really work with aside from the one she's been in with since she was a very young person. But when we look at it from the outside looking in, he was highly controlling, deeply possessive. He would constantly keep tabs on her. And that in itself says, ooh, this is not the guy for you. First of all, he's in his 26th year. He should be at a point where he understands the impact of this kind of behaviour. If he doesn't and it's entrenched and ingrained, the likelihood of it changing is going to be minimal. But all she has seen is a guy who's really into her. And as she started to become a bit concerned about it, she's still probably going to be thinking the best of his intentions, not the worst of his intentions, because of her inexperience in relationships. But as it moves through those first months, she just doesn't know how to deal with him. She's torn between the attraction that she genuinely has for him, but also between the fear that develops pretty early on. Because it's evident that Lane intends that she is going to be his, that he doesn't want her to be seeing anybody else, and that his jealousy is a jealousy that becomes rageful. He's very jealous of a long-term relationship with Ashley. Now, initially, Ashley has absolutely no idea what's going on. But as Shana and Lane grow closer, he and Shana start to grow apart, which makes perfect sense because there is an intensity, isn't there, in a relationship? And when your partner has started to have deeper feelings elsewhere, it changes the rhythm. And often that alienation occurs because it's the first stage in lessening the bonds between you and the partner that you're either intending to leave or that you're splitting your energy with because you're seeing somebody else. And they do actually ultimately separate. We get to December 2015. Even though she's in a situation where she's caused fractures in her foundation of her relationship with Ashley, Shana actually does end the relationship with Lane. And then she gets back together with Ashley. But Lane, just as we'd expect with an intimate stalker, is not prepared for 1 second to accept it. He is completely fixated, completely obsessed with her. And things start to happen in her life that she knows she can link to him. So first of all, her car starts to get vandalised. On one occasion, her car tyres are actually slashed. This is about inconveniencing someone. It's about costing somebody money. It's also about saying, I'm here. I might not be seen by you, but I'm around you. That power play and domination is very typical of these kind of stalkers. And again, that messaging, when you consider her age, is going to be absolutely terrifying. Now, Lane, when he's done this slashing of the tyres, would just happen to pass by and then just become the hero, rescue her, replacing the damaged tyres. Now, clearly she would be deeply suspicious of him, but we were also seeing a real immaturity here to Lane's behaviour. The fact that he's slashing the tyres and then just turning up like a hero when he's clearly caused the damage means that he underestimates the average human being who's like, you know, I'm all into coincidence and yeah, I'm really glad that you can replace my tyres. But you know, this feels just a little bit too close for comfort. And she will be doing the maths at this moment in time. But what you're going to do, of course, you're going to accept help off somebody who is schooled in how to deal with these kind of situations, and you want to get your car back on the road. But he's using this tactic as an opportunity to connect with her and an opportunity again to inflate his own ego and ideally to inflate his position in her life. Now, these tactics fail. Of course they do, because it's like he's literally at primary school coming out with this kind of very basic types of aggression and manipulation. But because of that, he starts to up the ante. His behaviour just becomes even more alarming. And this is when he starts to hide and hang around near where she lives. And it's absolutely blindsiding when that happens. I'm sure that some of you listening have been stalked. And you know the way that it literally deconstructs your sense of personal security. It makes everything that you know feel unfamiliar. It makes everything you trust feel vulnerable. And he is doing this to her regularly. Also, he starts to physically follow her around. He starts sending her these really threatening legal type letters because he claims there is a debt that she owes him. And basically he's demanding money back for the gifts that he bought her. And he goes even further than this. And this is enough. Let's all be honest, at this moment in time, first of all, you send gifts to somebody, that's the nature of gifts. You know, can you imagine how many annoyed parents would be recouping all the money from their teenagers when they've gone from being those perfect little people into rebellious individuals who say things like, no, mum. You'd be like, right, Let me tell you, there are several legal letters coming your way for all of the nice stuff that I bought you, believing you were a really sweet kid. And now you're not. I want them all back. You know? It'd be a list of thousands of pounds worth over the years, wouldn't it? You know, we don't do that. It's a gift. You don't get to backtrack on your gift. But this is what he's doing. So he's trying to trap her in lots of different ways, both on a physical and emotional, but also now in a scary legal connection. And that's going to really make her feel vulnerable in her world on so many levels. Also, he starts to threaten her. He says, you know what? I have saved all of the intimate messages that we've exchanged between each other, and I'm going to use them against you. So effectively, he's trying to blackmail her. And she is a young teenager, right? She hasn't been educated in the way of the world or relationships, but when it comes down to intimate messages, I have worked with people of 40 who fell into this situation where they've been threatened by an ex because they have intimate pictures of them on the phone or video. I've had cases where people have sent those videos to work colleagues of the individual. I have seen how the law has changed. It's taken seriously now, but let me tell you, 10, 15 years ago, this was commonplace. There were websites where people could upload these kind of highly exposing and inappropriate messages that had been trusted between two parties onto the web. With respect, even though we know if you're going to send any kind of intimate messages, you should never put your face on them. Genuinely, it's one of the things that I've always advised working with young people through the years. Firstly, because if you're under 18, it's actually a problem because it's an illegal distribution of inappropriate material. You can see people put on the sex offenders register. And even though those consenting parties felt that they were doing nothing wrong, it's very illegal. But also when it comes down to just not being identified, you know, no one can threaten you really if your head is not on the picture. Simple as that. And even though that's coming across like a bit of an advice and guidance session, it's because I think everyone should know that. It is so disconcerting, it is so debilitating, it's so upsetting when somebody has power over you because they've got the images that they have and they're using those images to threaten you. And like I said, there's been a lot of changes in the law. It's taken a great deal more seriously now, but a lot of women and a lot of men don't actually feel that they can go to the authorities about this because they feel really embarrassed. And therefore the leverage over them, the psychological power and domination of a perpetrator that we're talking about, like I'm talking about today, it exists still in spite of legal framework changes. So he's blackmailing her. Also, he sends messages to Ashley. And on one occasion, Ashley's car actually gets damaged and there's a note left on it. Dear Ash, Shana has and always will cheat on you. Happy New Year. Again, what is that telling you about this man? It's telling you that he is absolutely engaged in an appetite of destruction. He wants to make her pay on every single level and he wants to eradicate the potential and possibility of her being happy in a relationship with Ashley. We get to the 8th of February 2016. Now, by this point, she has been harassed for months. She's been receiving unwanted flowers from Lane. She's been having her car repeatedly vandalised. She's been having her tyres deflated consistently. And it gets to that point where Shana is starting to think, this isn't going away. I need to do something practical. And it's at this point she decides, rightly, that she's going to make her first contact with Sussex Police. And she actually starts the call. I don't really know how to start this conversation, but I think I'm being stalked. That, for me, is so powerful because this is a young girl. She's had a lovely life up until this point. She's very loved. She's got great friends. Everyone adores her. And she's never had to really manage a situation that falls outside the remit of what I've just described. And suddenly she's in a scenario where she's thinking to herself, have I done anything wrong by speaking to the police? Is it right that I'm saying it's stalking? Does this actually fit stalking? She knows she's been in a relationship with this guy, so there'll be a part of her that feels that somehow she's got to pay for that choice. And it's so confusing and conflicting that even though to us it's absolutely obvious, not only Is she being stalked? She's being really badly abused. For her, it feels quite abstract, and there'll be guilt associated with it as well, because of course she used to like Lane. So that meek-mannered response of, I don't really know whether, but I need to kind of speak to you, that speaks to her own concern that maybe she's overreacting, which she clearly isn't. Now, she goes on to express that she has a fear of Lane, that he's being very obsessive, and also that he's constantly harassing her. The police do the right thing at that point. They go and speak to Lane. They warn him, you need to leave Shana alone. Initially, as is in so many cases, he withdraws, but it does not last for very long at all. And the minute that we're in a situation where the police have actually gone and spoken to a perpetrator, and that perpetrator has been told, you need to stop A, B, and C, and they say, okay. If they then breach that boundary, they are telling you straight away that they do not see the authority in the way that they need to. And secondly, they're willing to disregard the authority because their fixation and obsession is so enormous. And that immediately makes them dangerous. Immediately. We get to the 24th of March 2016. Now it's late at night at this point, and Lane just turns up at Shana's house with her two housemates after a party. So he has stuck himself to these two housemates. They've obviously had a drink. They probably aren't aware of just how scared Shana is, and he ends up tagging along home. Now at this point, she is really unhappy, understandably. It's an unannounced visit. She wasn't expecting it. She isn't prepared for it, and she immediately leaves the property. Now the way that Lane deals with this is that he follows her. And as she's walking down the road and she's trying to get away from him, note the behaviour. She does not want to be near you. Not only does he follow her, he pulls her hair, he grabs her phone off her, and then in the process, he hits her. Now, bear in mind, we're talking about a high-level, unprovoked attack in that moment. This is the escalation, and we are starting to see the amplification of this behaviour that is incredibly dangerous. She goes straight to Ashley's family home. She's crying. She's hyperventilating, so she's having a panic attack. And Ashley's mother rightly and absolutely calls the police, and she reports the assault. Now, at this point, an officer, PC Trevor Godfrey, he quickly responds. However, I don't know whether PC Trevor Godfrey ever got the training that was actually required for such circumstances. I'm imagining not, or I'm imagining a willful ignorance of the rules otherwise. Because in breach of police guidelines, first of all, he interviews Shana in front of Ashley and his family. That puts her in an incredibly difficult situation. Remember, she's got this intimate history with Lane. She's in front of Ashley's parents. So would you sit there and go, well, I was basically being unfaithful in my relationship. So this guy and me, we were kind of hanging out physically, intimately, and he's twisted and decided now that he's going to stalk and harass me. And I've gone back to what was my boyfriend who I was cheating on, and then was my ex-boyfriend, but then I've gone back to, and these are his parents, and it's all going to be fine because no one's going to judge me in this situation, are they? So she absolutely, I can completely relate to this, lies. She doesn't disclose that she's got this secret on-off relationship with him to the officer. So then, because PC Godfrey hasn't given her the time and space and hasn't followed the regulationary guidelines of how to manage this situation, they've only got this bit of a story. They then go and speak to Lane, who of course gets out there, I'm the victim. At the end of the day, Shana and me are having a sexual relationship. Look at all these texts between us. All of this supports my claim that she's a liar. We've had a tiff, and at the end of the day, she just doesn't want her boyfriend to know that she's been doing this with me. So PC Godfrey, in spite of being present at all those scenarios and situations, decides that the best conclusion is that it was just a lover's tiff. And also that Shana's claims of stalking and of an assault were in fact a smokescreen to hide this secret affair that she was having. So concludes that Lane is absolutely no risk whatsoever. In fact, he literally just cautioned Lane for the assault, but instead decides to punish Shana. I kid you not. I kid you not. In this scenario, where we have this young girl who is being violently assaulted, who's been followed down her own street by a man who's invited himself to the home without any invite from her, who has been slashing her tyres, who has been trying to break her and her boyfriend up, he decides, after breaching protocol and interviewing her in front of her partner, that what he is going to do is to fine her £90 because she didn't disclose that she was in a relationship with Lane and for wasting police time. So basically, Lane is viewed as the victim and Shana is viewed as the person in the wrong. So basically, stroke unbelievably, Lane is viewed as the victim and Shana is seen as the person in the wrong. Now, can you imagine the impact that's going to have on her? She's in a scenario where she's trusted the police, and as opposed to them empathetically understanding her position, and as opposed to them actually knowing anything about stalking, because this is not uncommon behaviour. The idea that a stalker is a stranger is so far from the truth. The reality is, stalkers are often people that have been intimately involved with a person, the relationship is broken down, and then that individual cannot let it go. This is what's happening. So of course he's got all this information. That does not discount the logistics, reality and psychological trauma that this girl is going through. But now she's been hit with a fine, told she's wasted police time, and she is going to be terrified of actually speaking to the authorities again. Of course she is, because she's thinking to herself, well, this has happened on the first opportunity to kind of really engage with them. What will be next? Will I be arrested? Will I be put in prison? Because when you are young, dealing with the police is scary enough. But when you are young and you're dealing with the police who are telling you you're wasting their time and that you are culpable when you are actually dealing in reality with a horrendous situation of stalking, it's going to blindside you. Now, for Lane, this is brilliant because now he's basically been given the go-ahead. Very few consequences to his actions. In fact, now she's been seen as the perpetrator. So this just means that he's going to absolutely have free license to continue these actions. And as I've said, Shana's now been really shaken by the police. She's reluctant to give any further reports. So we have this dual experience where he's growing in confidence without consequences, and she is now scared of the people who can protect her, which gives him even more power. Now it gets so bad for this girl that Shana quits her job, but it does nothing. It doesn't deter Lane at all. So you can just see how unhappy she is. And you can see how powerful he is. She's removing herself from financial security to prevent herself seeing him. She's doing as much as she can to extricate herself from any kind of familiarity with this man. But of course, he's now fixated. He wants to control her. If he can't have her, then no one can. And he goes so far as in July 2016 to steal her back door key. On the 9th of July 2016 at 6 a.m, Lane physically lets himself in to Shana's house. He even enters her bedroom and he just stands there, watching her sleep. But the thing is, Shana wasn't asleep. She heard the footsteps. She heard someone coming into her room. She could disturbingly hear a man breathing and she was terrified. She was fully awake, just hiding beneath her duvet. It brings back those memories of when we're children, doesn't it? We know that the duvet can't protect us, but we feel that just by hiding from the world, somehow we'll be protected. And she goes back into that state in that moment. Just hope, pray, he'll just leave. And he does. After a minute or so, Lane leaves. Shana looks out of the window and she confirms that him, because she can see him walking away. Now at this point she realises he has breached a boundary and she can prove that, so she calls the police at 6:48 a.m. She wants to prove at this point, look, this is real, this is what Lane's done. I want to be able to present this evidence to the police so they can see I'm not lying. So to gather the evidence, she actually confronts him over the phone and she records the conversation. That is a smart cookie. That is somebody who's saying, you know, I know they're not taking me seriously. I need to evidence something that's actually going to be palpable for the police. I'll have this tangible, real conversation that no one can dispute. So that's what she does. She asks him, why'd you take in the key? He says on the phone, I just wanted to see you. Promises that he wouldn't do it again, like every stalker in the history of time. And he even says that he'll stay away from her. Now, after this incident, Shana and her housemates are really, really worried. You know, this is a real breach into their security. It makes them feel highly vulnerable. So they change the locks on the doors. Now, despite Shana's previous complaints against Lane, despite the absolute evidence that she's now presented to them, proving that he'd entered the property without her permission, the police decide that they're just going to give him a slap on the wrist. In fact, when I say slap on the wrist, I mean it's the lightest possibility of a slap. It's not even something that constitutes the reality of what I'm talking about. They just caution him for the theft of the key. The theft of the key. That's like somebody comes into your backyard, removes a sock from your washing line. We're talking about that parallel criminality-wise. This man has manipulated a situation where he can steal a house key, where he has then entered a property without permission, intimidated a victim, and as opposed to them charging him for that, he's been cautioned for the theft of the key. The minimisation in this case isn't just alarming, it's life-threatening. It really is. We're talking about someone clearly with form who has on multiple occasions now ignored the authorities, and still he's getting absolutely no consequences. You know, they say stay away from Shana as well, but there's no motivation to do that. He can literally break into her home and the police don't care. Now, these kind of warnings, statistically, when you look at stalking, they always get ignored by obsessive stalkers. It doesn't matter what you say to them. They are too far gone down this street. And therefore, the authorities need to do something that is far more senior and consequential to this kind of warning if they actually want to get any change. Now, the officer who dealt with the incident, PC John Barry Mills, he would later have the audacity to try to defend the decision. And he said this, I had been considering a stalking or harassment offence, but when he arrived at the address, I definitely had the evidence to prove a theft. What? Oh, okay. So let's just go through that a minute. So you're saying that you could have had him done for stalking and harassment because, you know, you had the evidence for that. Like a whole phone call where an individual admits breaking and entering a house without permission after stealing a key, you know, and the past experiences that she's kind of talked about. But you thought, well, I can definitely prove the theft of a key. So therefore, I'm going to ignore the much more serious reality of evidence so that I don't have as much paperwork to follow up on. Yep, that's it. Got it in one. Honestly. Ugh. Now, he actually later resigns from the police force in 2019, and that's prior, surprisingly, to a disciplinary hearing over his handling of the Shana case. So what we know is that he went before he was pushed, essentially. Just jump before you're pushed every day of the week. He had control there. He resigned. Therefore, he doesn't need to face the consequences that are obviously very, very serious. But I mean, what a disregard for your job, what a disregard for your order to serve and protect, to literally know that you have the evidence absolutely available to you that says this girl is being stalked, this girl is being harassed, this girl has had somebody stood over her bed and you charged him with the theft of a key. Shame on you. And I mean, this case is just full of those realities. Shame on them. It's despicable. Absolutely despicable. Now, this incident, of course, does nothing now to deter Lane. He just continues to harass Shana. And the very next day, she's bombarded with calls from a block number. During one of them, she does actually manage to hear what she says was heavy breathing, and she could tell it was a male voice. Again, at this point, she's trying to get support from the authorities. She reports her concerns to the police. Yet incredibly, despite everything that I've been through so far, despite everything that has happened, she's advised there are no further lines of inquiry and that the case would be left on a file.
Why did you take the key in the first place?
I wanted to see you and be secure. I knew you wouldn't let me in otherwise.
Yeah, but that's not good because it's putting us in danger. You could have flipped at any point. It's out of order.
Yeah, I know. I just don't want to get in trouble.
Well, just as long you just don't do it again. And if you come near the house again,
I won't come near the house again. I won't contact you again. Okay?
I think that's best.
She's been abandoned. Literally abandoned by the very services who are meant to protect her. She's being told basically, I'm sorry, we're not going to do anything. We'll leave the file open to some degree. Anything new that occurs, well, you can always come back to us, but we don't feel there's a case to answer. This man is absolutely traumatizing and harassing this young girl. And the police are basically saying, sorry, no can do. Shana at this point needs to get protection, so she starts to talk to her friends and her family. She asks them for help. She is so concerned about her physical safety that she actually asks them to contact her if she hasn't been in touch for a few hours. She's clearly fearing that the worst could happen. And when you're saying to people, if you don't hear from me in a few hours, you need to be worried, that's because she's thinking about her physical safety. She's thinking about her life being under threat. We're at that point. The same point where the police in parallel think there's nothing to worry about. Now, Shana has no idea at this point, but Lane has gone even further. He's actually fitted a tracker to her car. So he has taken stalking to the highest level. He's using this app on his mobile phone, and every single time she moves the car, he gets this alert. And this is pumping that fixation and obsession. It's connecting him in. Notifications on our phones psychologically mean that we are connected to it regularly. Our attention is always on that particular reality. And we see the same can be good when it comes down to messages that are positive, or maybe notifications that are telling us about drinking our water. They're positive opportunities, but it can also be used malevolently. And in this case, the fixation is being pumped by this app where he is literally looking at where she is going next. Now, because of the fact he can track her movements, because he can follow her in his car, he is constantly able to apply as much energy as he wants to without too much concern about finding her, because he always knows where she is. So he has complete control over her movements. And he would even return back to her car at regular intervals because he would want to recharge the batteries in the device. He is absolutely upping the ante when it comes down to his stalking behaviour. And poor Shana will be wondering how on earth this man knows where she is. And even though she won't always realise that he's following her, there will be moments where she'll just suspect it and feel it as like an intuition. And it will be deeply concerning because the invasion of privacy is just so enormous. And she has no power over it. We get to the 12th of July 2016. Shana makes another report to the police. This time she's realised, I'm being followed by this man. But again, seems like the police don't really care. They've jumped to conclusions about the relationship between Shana and Lane, and as far as they're concerned, you know, she's invited this because she's been in an intimate relationship, lovers, tiffs, etc. And when the investigating officer is informed of the fact that Shana has now said this man's following me, he categorised it as low risk. Low risk. I mean, what is the bar for being a moderate risk or a high risk? This man has broken into her home, stood over her bed, has been tracking her in a car, has been slashing her tires, has been doing a whole range of very high level predatory behaviours. And he's being noted as low risk. Does that mean that Shana's life is something that we should just not really value? Because to me, what we're talking about here, aside from the obvious psychological disturbance that she's dealing with, aside from the fact that she now feels that her own world no longer has freedom because she's constantly being followed, she's already inciting her family to check on her consistently because she clearly feels totally at threat physically. How is this low risk? And how are people like PC Mills failing so devastatingly? And PC Mills actually doesn't even contact Shana. She doesn't update Shana about the incident that she's talked about. And instead, in spite of the fact that she's repeatedly now reporting because she's trying to get some kind of action, she just receives a letter from the police saying that the case is now closed. So now Shana's being failed by the police service, as well as inciting her stalker to understand that pretty much he can get away with anything. There are no consequences at all, that he can make a life hell with apparent impunity. It's disgraceful. Imagine being Shana, because it's hard sometimes, isn't it? We talk about these cases, we think about these victims, but just placing yourself for a second in Shana's position. She's being abandoned by the people who are meant to protect her. She must have felt absolutely helpless and powerless and desperate and totally abandoned and isolated in this case. We get to the 4th of August 2016. Now, of course, he's been told to stay away from Shana. Authorities have said, you can't go around, you've got to stop this behaviour, a little slap on the wrist. Shana sees Lane. He's loitering outside her house multiple times. But by this point, she's really reluctant to inform the police. And she actually speaks to her friend who'd witnessed Lane's behaviour. And she says, I'm just really worried that they're not going to take my allegations seriously. And I've been fined prior to this. The police have closed my case reports. And I just don't think there's any point speaking to the police about this further harassment. So she doesn't report it. And I have absolute sympathy and empathy for that young girl. Why would you report it? I would be literally terrified of the police at this moment in time. And it also speaks to when people decide to take things into their own hands. I know we're not talking about that in this case, but if I think about a child of mine, for example, being dealt such serious blows by the authorities who are meant to be there to protect them, I could certainly see myself going and doing something that essentially could put me at risk, because I would be so full of vitriol and I would be so angry with the services that were meant to be dealing with the situation that I would feel I had no option. And when you think about vigilante behaviour, the way that these systemic failures have occurred in this case, you could absolutely forgive somebody thinking, I'm going to take the law into my own hands. And like I said, it doesn't happen in this case, but I would have every sympathy and empathy for Shana's family or partner to actually go ahead and do something to teach this guy a lesson. Because nothing is happening. He's just getting carte blanche with this harassment. We get to the 23rd of August 2016. Now, Shana actually agrees that she's going to meet with Lane because she wants to make it fundamentally clear to him that the relationship is over. Now, in total, by this point, she'd reported him to the police 5 times in 6 months. But it had done absolutely nothing to stop his behaviour. Her life had become a complete nightmare. Her mental health had been affected. Her physical health was being affected. She was literally suffering from crippling panic attacks. She was living in a psychologically torturous state, a prison, that while she's walking free, Lane has actually got the keys to that cell, essentially. That yes, she isn't in a physical cell, but she's incarcerated in a mental one that he has created, and she wants to be free of it. She wants to get away from him. She meets him in a hotel in Hove that evening, and she just insists it's over. She tells him, I'm back with Ashley, I love Ashley, I want to be with Ashley, please respect my wishes. But for Lane, it isn't over. For Lane, as far as he is concerned, if he can't have her, No one can. Now, at this point, he starts to feel rageful, angry. His mood is depressed because he's been dumped. And he subsequently says to a friend, she'll pay for what she's done. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if I hear sentences like that, I challenge them. I'd be like, what's she done? She's ended a relationship with you. Like, it happens every single day of the week, every second of the day. People end relationships. She doesn't owe you anything. At the end of the day, you don't want to be with somebody who doesn't want to be with you. Grow up, move forward, move on. Because if somebody says she'll pay for what she's done, I instantly hear threat, and I'm going to respond to that threat. And the very fact that he feels he has a right to control her because she hasn't acted in a way that he feels is acceptable towards him, and that she consequently needs to pay for that, I find that really disturbing. Now, bear in mind, he'd already got away with entering Shana's house once, so why wouldn't he do it again? And now he's really angry with her, and now she's severed those ties. He thinks, well, maybe I can take it to a whole new level. And this is the thing about no consequences. And it's also why victims are often in a far more desperate situation when they leave bad relationships than when they're in them. The brutality they experience during a relationship can be terrifying. But when they seek to escape, that's when the perpetrator will often make decisions that are catastrophic for that victim, because that person thinks, I'm not going to let you have a life at all. We get to the 24th of August 2016. At this point, Lane is captured on CCTV buying a can of petrol. Now, that's sinister enough. It really is. It's very rare that people break down and need to go and buy petrol. And when you think about the kind of individual that we're dealing with, what's premeditated in his mind? What's planned? What's he thinking and considering? We get to the 25th of August 2016. Lane sets off from his home in his car. It's just before 7:25 a.m. in the morning. Now, he's carrying at that time various items of clothing. He's got a high visibility jacket. He's got a blue peaked cap. Now, less than 10 minutes later, he entered Shana's bungalow on Christery Road. He knew she'd be alone. He knew that her two housemates would both have left for work. Now, we may never know 100% ultimately what happened when he went in and confronted Shana. What a neighbour said is that they heard a really raised female voice coming from the property around the time. There wasn't any screaming, so there wasn't screaming or sounds of a struggle. It didn't seem like there was some kind of physical altercation that was obvious to that neighbour. So it does suggest that Shana wasn't necessarily ambushed or attacked without warning. So it's more likely that she knew that Lane was in the home. But even though he's in the home and that would have been soul destroying for her and very scary, it's unlikely that she would have been in that moment able to anticipate what was going to happen next. So she would have been totally unprepared for the reality. And I think we see this with the bias that we have in the way that we live in our lives, because we have to have this bias of security, don't we? We have to have this myth of security. Psychologically, you have to trust that when you eat your cornflakes in the morning, you're not going to choke to death. You have to believe that when you go to bed at night, you're not going to fall out and die. Even though things like that do happen and ultimately people do lose their lives, you can't live that way. You just have to always imagine it will be okay. So even in a scenario where somebody is confronted by an individual whose behaviour is just so outside appropriate, the idea of taking it to the extreme and thinking this person is really going to harm me now is something that very few of us would ever amplify to that level. And that's why we see people murdered by partners, for example, because they anticipate this person couldn't possibly be doing that to me, even though they've done all this other stuff. It's that security psychologically of bias to believe that it will be okay, even when things are patently not okay. So her anticipation is probably, here we go, another altercation, him wanting me back, me having to tell him no. But that's not going to play out this time, because Lane takes a knife. They don't know whether he brought it with him or whether they took it from Shana's kitchen. They know that it was never found. But around 7:40 a.m, he slits Shana's throat. The likelihood he was standing behind her. At this point, she would have slumped to the floor by a bed, and that's where she subsequently bleeds to death. She was 19 years old, 19. Hadn't lived long, hadn't had the opportunity to thrive in her world, didn't have a chance to get married, have kids. 19 years old, bleeding to death on a bedroom floor by a perpetrator that should have been time and time again taken seriously as a threat to her life. And also, her death wasn't instant. She would have known she was bleeding out. It must have been physically and mentally soul destroying and terrifying for her. Lane is prepared. He's not arrived to have a conversation with her. He's arrived to murder her. It's as simple as that. So he's prepared. He changes into the high-vis jacket and cap that he's bought. He pulls it down low over his face. He puts on a hoodie, probably stolen from the house, and he pulls the hood up. Then he takes Shana's bank cards and he leaves. Now he's caught again on CCTV. At this point, he's looking down at the ground because he doesn't want to have his face being connected and caught by CCTV. He has got Shana's bank card. He knows a PIN number, so he goes to a nearby cash point on Graham Avenue. He arrives there shortly before 8 a.m. Again, at this point, is caught on CCTV. Is around 20 feet away from the cash point. And shortly after this sighting, unbelievably, Shana's card is used in the machine. Why? Because this total narcissist wanted to steal a sum of money from her account because he believed that she owed him a debt for those presents, etc. After literally cutting this young woman's throat, stealing her future, staining her family with the loss of such a traumatic loss, all he's thinking about is what she owes him in his warped mind. Now, the amount that he wants, there are insufficient funds there. So instead he checks the balance and he removes £60 from her bank. That was the maximum he could remove. Lane isn't finished by this point. Yeah, he's killed her. Yeah, he thinks he's disguised himself. Now he's got some money back to address what he believes are her misdemeanors in his life. Even though he's just stolen her life, a priceless being, he still wants financial gain from it. But this isn't over. It's the second part of his plan because he wants to get away with it. He has full intention of destroying the crime scene and destroying the incriminating evidence. So he's really thought about this. He's ruminated on how he's going to get away with it, and he's intending to. He returns to his car. He drives to a shop. He checks a lottery ticket. I mean, could you be any more psychopathic in the way you're acting? Just check whether I've won the lottery. That's a motivation when we're thinking about what I've just described playing out only minutes before. Then he purchases a bottle of water. And the reason that he purchases that bottle of water, it's believed, is he empties the water out and he fills the bottle with petrol from the can that he'd bought earlier. Then he returns to Shana's house. Again, he's caught walking on CCTV. He's going towards the property. This is at 8:22 a.m. and at this point he's carrying a plastic bag. He dismantles the smoke alarm in the hallway. He doesn't want anyone to be alerted to the fire. Again, so premeditated. Then he goes back into Shana's room, places her body on the bed, pours petrol over her body, as well as on the bed, as well as on the floor around it. Then he sets it alight, closes the bedroom door, and leaves the property. And he did that for one reason, with the clear intent of annihilating Shana's body and any evidence of his crime. And then he just returns home. No doubt he wants to clean the blood off himself, he wants to dispose of the clothes, he wants to get rid of the murder weapon, but this man is so cold and calculating, premeditated and planned. And Shana's worst nightmare, her biggest fear, is played out in reality. Now I have to say, Lane's efforts to actually destroy the crime scene may have been successful if only he'd paid better attention in his chemistry class at school, and I'll tell you why. Fire needs oxygen to burn. So initially, the fire does take hold and Shana's body was burned, but because the door is closed and there's no window open in the room, the fire runs out of oxygen and it extinguished itself before everything was completely incinerated. So he had a plan, he thought he knew better, but he didn't execute it appropriately. Now, when Shana fails to turn up for work later that day, obviously people are concerned. They know what's been going on in her life. They're worried about the potential of what could have played out. So the colleagues raise the alarm. Ashley's sister at this point goes to check on her, and you've got to just think about how loved Shana was, you know? They have this group of people that are around her who genuinely care about her well-being. Genuinely, I think a lot of us will know situations at work where people haven't turned in and we don't really pay attention to it. We just think they're bunking off. But that wasn't the case here. Shana is so loved, she's so embraced, she's so cradled by these people around her that it's an instant reaction. And Ashley's poor sister, who's done the great thing to go and check on the welfare of somebody that is obviously really important in her life, she's met with a bloody footprint on the doorstep. Shana's body is actually later discovered by Ashley's own father, Ian Cook. And Ian discovers her body face down on a bed in this smoke-filled room. There'd been a piece of cardboard actually wedged into the door to keep it closed. So instantly he knows he's dealing with a murder. Later that day, the very same day, Lane's arrested. They arrest him at his workplace, obviously on suspicion of murder. And during questioning, he is one of those individuals who just keeps changing the story. So initially he's like, oh, I hadn't been to Shana's house that morning. No, I've had nothing to do with it. I've not been anywhere near. But then ultimately, as things start to kind of weigh against him, it's like, oh, you know what? Actually, I did go there. And when he's asked why, he's like, oh, so I did go. And the reason that I went, because I'm having to think really fast on my feet now because clearly things aren't adding up and you're starting to think that maybe I am the perpetrator. So I'm going to say I went there to tell her I didn't want to speak to her ever again. You went to the place where you had a conversation to tell the person that you didn't want to speak to again, that you didn't want to speak to them. That's it. Got it in one. But you were speaking to them to tell them that you didn't want to speak to them. I did, and that might seem counterproductive to my argument, but just go with me on this. I'm saying I went to tell her that I never want to speak to her again so that she didn't speak to me again. But she wasn't speaking to you. That was the whole thing. She wasn't speaking to you. So why did you need to tell her not to speak to you when she wasn't actually speaking to you? Again, I see where you're going with this. It kind of makes sense to you. But for me, in my weird world of a potential alibi, I'm saying I just went over to tell her, let's not speak anymore. You are so guilty. I'm just going to get this big red guilty button, press it, and then you're going to go through the floor and go straight to hell. Is that okay? Honestly, this is so frustrating. So yeah, apparently, according to Lane, he arrives to deliver this news to Shana that he never wants to speak to her again by speaking to her again, and the front door's open. So he goes inside and then he just finds Shana dead in her room. Now, at that point, because obviously he's completely innocent, I mean, he's just there to tell this girl to not speak to him again. So he has nothing to worry about, does he? No problem. Now he's confronted with her body, somebody that, okay, he doesn't want to speak to anymore, but clearly he's innocent regarding the actual crime that's played out. So he's going to ring 999. He's going to get the emergency services, isn't he? Because at the end of the day, you find somebody dead in their room. First off, you're going to want to try and figure out their vital signs and see whether you can protect and save them. Secondly, you're going to speak to emergency services because damn straight you're going to want them there because they're going to be able to help. Most importantly, you're going to be blindsided with shock. You're not going to be thinking about what do I do next. You're going to be thinking about, oh my God, this person I know is dead. But according to him, he panics, normal, We'd expect panic in a traumatic situation, but he's like, I panicked, but in a really, shall we say, suspicious way. To the degree where I thought, well, you know what? I may be considered a suspect. The police may consider me responsible. So instead of doing the most normal thing for an innocent person to do, by calling the emergency services, I left. Apparently, he left without checking whether she was alive or even reporting it to the police. Also, he then goes on to actually deny that he was the guy in the high-vis jacket and hoodie on CCTV. Now, when he's presented with the evidence of purchasing petrol, he says, yeah, you know what, I did. I am on CCTV. You have got pictures of me, literally in video, buying said flammable liquid. But I do have a reason for this, and the reason is I'm depressed and I was going to set myself on fire. Well, you had plenty of time. So you've just failed with that potential suggestion, haven't you? Because you got the bottle, you could have done it there and then, but seemingly you haven't. And now, interestingly enough, there's a connection with another crime where a woman that you're linked to regarding stalking and harassment essentially has been set on fire. Is this not just kind of like causing you to think about, well, I don't know, too many coincidences, shall we say? But he says, no, I was just really depressed. My grandfather had died, and that's why I thought about setting myself on fire. But of course, then they look at searching some of his vital areas, such as his car. And in his car, they uncover 60 quid in cash. So 2 20s and 2 10s. That's the exact same amount of money that had been withdrawn from Shana's account shortly before she was killed. This guy is bang to rights every single day of the week. Also, 5 days after the killing, his bloodstained trainers were found in a field nearby Shana's home, and they matched a bloody footprint found at the crime scene. It is unbelievable that this man has such a superior belief system and arrogance within himself that he genuinely thinks, in spite of all this overwhelming evidence, somehow people are going to believe his bullshit. We get to March 2017. Now, despite everything I've just told you, despite him being entirely bang to rights in this situation, he, of course, decides that he's going to plead not guilty. Not guilty. And on one level, there is a comedic value to that, because we all sit there going, what are you doing? Like, it is so obvious that you are the person who has carried out this crime. There are so many links in the chain leading directly to you. But when you think about this kind of individual, they do not have the empathy, compassion, they do not have the care and concern and consideration for anybody other than themselves. So they want to do whatever it takes to pull the wool over the eyes of the public. They want to escape, they want to avoid justice. They believe their own BS. But the problem is that also means that Shana's family, her grieving parents, all of those who love her, are put through the ordeal of a trial, and that is unforgivable. I think that they should extend sentences massively when individuals do this, particularly in light of the weight of evidence, because how dare they traumatise further a family who are enduring such horrific loss. Now, during Lane's trial, 12 women gave evidence. This is unbelievable, guys. So 12 women give evidence, dates back all the way to 2005. All of them testify they had been harassed by Lane. Furthermore, they had reported the behaviour to the police at the time. So 12 women had said, this guy is not right. This guy's behaviour is reprehensible. This guy's behaviour is scary. The police did nothing. And unbelievably, Shana's murder was the first offence that Lane had actually been prosecuted for. They just willfully ignored these complaints. And now a 19-year-old girl has had her throat slit and has been set on fire because of their pathetic engagement and lack of, in this case, with this man. We get to the 22nd of March 2017. It's after a 2-week trial and just 2 hours of deliberation. Of course, the jury immediately find Lane guilty of Shana's murder. Honestly, they didn't even need 2 hours. Can we all be honest here? They likely had 1 minute of deliberation and then spent the rest of their time talking about how reprehensible POS this guy was. When they read the verdict out, of course, he showed very little emotion because he is as emotionless as a stone. There is nothing going on, is there? Then we get to the 23rd of March 2017. This is when 27-year-old Lane is sentenced at Lewes Crown Court. And Judge Mr. Justice Green had a lot to say about this particular case, and in particular, the aggravating factors, because they were several aggravating factors. First of all, the hugely premeditated nature of the crime. He'd purchased the petrol the day before. He'd waited until Shana was alone in the house before he killed her. He'd then attempted to destroy any of the evidence with fire. He'd had a complete lack of remorse for the fact that his actions had stolen her life, and the fact that he'd even stolen from her after he'd killed her. So all of these are massive contributors. Ultimately, he was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 25 years. So there are sterner sentences, but nonetheless, this would still be considered in the UK quite a long sentence, though it deeply concerns me that this kind of perpetrator would ever get to walk the streets again. These kind of individuals, I genuinely believe, are hardwired to this type of behaviour. I don't believe that they follow rules. I don't believe they care about authority. I do feel that they have a power desire that is so enormous that if somebody affects their psychology by making them feel that they don't have control anymore, the consequences can be, as we've seen in this case. How that will change after 25 years in prison, I don't know. Now, following Shana's death, understandably, there is a huge investigation into how Sussex police handled the case. In fact, it goes on for 2 years. 13 police staff were investigated for misconduct. 13. That is disgraceful. That so many could have got things so wrong. One of them is investigated for gross misconduct. That latter officer was PC Godfrey. Now, he was the one who fined Shana for wasting police time after she'd reported it. And at a misconduct hearing, he was the one who also defended his decision not to take action against Lane, claimed that he'd seen those text communications between them in which she'd signed messages off with kisses, as if signing off with kisses means that you are wanting the connection. A lot of people like myself, I put a kiss after every single text message, professional or personal. It's just how I communicate. But the idea that she's getting seen as culpable in this because of that is ludicrous. So that police officer was basically trying to suggest that she was trying to hide the affair, that she wasn't really in danger. And it goes without saying that he was massively mistaken to a degree where that person contributed as a police officer to the murder of this girl. Now, he was subsequently found guilty of misconduct, but bear in mind he'd already retired from the police force on full pension. On full pension. So this guy screwed up massively. This young girl died partly as a result of that screwing up, and he just gets to get in his merry way whilst he's paid a full pension from the police. Meanwhile, a disciplinary panel found that PC Mills, that was the police officer who'd only chosen to caution Lane for theft after he'd basically entered Shana's house and stood over her bed. They said, yeah, look, if we had held this panel when he was employed, we would have dismissed him from the force for gross misconduct, but he'd already essentially jumped before he was pushed. He'd already resigned. So essentially that never took place. So this is all retrospective and it's all really unhelpful because it doesn't actually create any change, does it? Both of those officers are gone. There are no real consequences for them. And the only consequences that have arrived are those that Shana's family, friends, partner have to manage. Now, there's a subsequent domestic homicide review, and that review identified that in addition to Lane's extensive history of stalking and harassment, extensive guys, he'd also been arrested on allegations that he'd groomed a 14-year-old girl in 2010. This is when he was a 21-year-old volunteer scout leader. Now, whilst he hadn't actually been charged at that point, the incident had remained on his record, but somehow it had just been overlooked. What were the police officers in this department doing? playing Candy Crush on their phones, eating donuts, I don't know. But they certainly weren't serving and protecting or doing the things that were required for this young girl to meet the protection level that was needed for her. This man is a predator, a stalker, a perpetual harasser, and it was noted and no one did a thing. Just got overlooked. Shana's complaining about this person with form, and yet no one did a thing. And incredibly, and this is just going to add insult to injury, in 2015, that predator had been able to volunteer for the Scouts again. It had been overlooked at that point too. This sexual predator was going to be allowed to volunteer for the Scouts to put all these kids at risk. Now, like many sexual predators, that speaks to how they surround themselves with their particular victim. So in this case, he wanted to be in an environment where he had easy access to young women and girls. And you think about the fact that he was 26 when he met Shana, that demonstrates that he had a particular predilection for younger women. And she did look quite young. So this is a man who arguably has got some very unhealthy appetites as well. The systematic failings within this enabled him to do all of those things. So yeah, Lane is a perpetrator, predator of the highest level, no doubt a sexual deviant, unhealthy interest in children, but he needed the help to carry out what he did. And the help came in the form of the failure of authorities, and that is absolutely horrifying. Now, the review identified that Lane's highly controlling behaviour in previous relationships, together with the countless complaints of him sexually harassing, pestering, stalking, even sexually assaulting women for over a decade, was somehow ignored, whereas Shana had been stereotyped and labelled as the one at fault. Somehow Lane was labelled as the victim. How absolutely horrifying. This young teenage girl is seen as the person at fault, when this man, with a long list of complaints against him, some incredibly disturbing ones, is seen as the victim. It's believed that on average a victim of stalking will experience 70 to 100 incidents before they even contact the police. So it's highly likely that Shana had been trying to deal alone with his behaviour for a hell of a long time before she even reached out. There were multiple opportunities for the police to stop Lane's stalking behaviour, but they failed to understand that someone could be in a relationship with their tormentor and still be in danger from them, which is absolutely insane. Look at domestic abuse, look at domestic homicide. You are far more likely to be killed by somebody you are in a relationship with. Lay people who have very little understanding of this field know that, but not the police in this department. No, in this department, the female is culpable for daring to raise her head above the parapet and say, "I am in danger, help me." The judge in this case said to the police, "You jumped to conclusions. She was treated as the wrongdoer and having committed a criminal offence, and Michael Lane was treated as the victim. There was seemingly no appreciation on the part of those investigating that a young woman in a sexual relationship with a man could at one and the same time be vulnerable and at risk of serious harm." And let's be honest, guys, in this case, she wasn't just at risk of serious harm. She was at risk of losing her life. I think the word harm just doesn't match what we talked about. She was murdered because of these failures. It's unbelievable to me that 12 other women complained about this man and no one seemed to have joined the dots together. No one recognised the serious danger that Shana was in, and she paid for the police's failings with her life. Now, police training and the way it handles stalking and harassment complaints have been reviewed since and revised. But I would say when I look at a report from 2019, that report has said that in spite of this, the cases are still not being properly handled or investigated by police forces. Either way, whatever lessons may have been learned, What I can say is they have come far too late for Shana, and far, far, far too late for so many of other women who have suffered an identical fate as she did. And it is not good enough. And I do appreciate that men also suffer stalking. We're looking at stalking in general and the catastrophic impact it has on people's lives and the catastrophic impact it can have on their families when those lives are stolen. It is astonishing to me, the failures in this case. It is astonishing to me that an 18-year-old girl was branded as wasting police time when she was in fact dealing with the most hostile experiences that we can imagine. A man who was predatory, a man who was harassing, a man who was threatening, and a man who eventually stole her life. Shame on that police force. And, you know, when it comes down to the police, I appreciate they do a really good job. I appreciate that for most police officers listening to this would be absolutely astonishing, and they will feel such anger that their own positions are brought into disrepute because of these kind of actions. But when these systemic and systematic failings occur, we have to call them out loudly, because Shana Grice paid the ultimate price, and that's unforgivable. I hope if you've heard this case before, I've told you a little bit more about it. I hope you feel the same level of frustration and fear and anger about the failures. And I hope that we can all agree that for Shana Grice, she may have now a legacy of changing things for other women, but what a cost. And at what cost to the people who loved her. She was an only child. And those loving parents have to live the rest of their lives knowing that they will never get the future that was ensured them because Lane stole it. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Leave me a comment, and let's just take a moment to acknowledge what an amazing girl Shana Grice was. Everybody loved her. She was vivacious, she was friendly, never grumpy, always loved life. And she should still be living life today. Take care. Take stalking seriously, guys. If it's happening to any of you, don't let the police put you off. Make them work for you. You deserve that safety.